Thank you to our small but brilliant audience for coming to the first USIHS talk of the semester. Today, I'm delighted that Dr. Immo Warntjes is here to speak to us. He is the Usher Assistant Professor of Early Medieval History at Trinity College, Dublin, and primarily works on early scientific thought in the Irish milieu. And I mainly included that word because I enjoy saying it. So I'm delighted that Immo will be speaking on Heinrich Zimmer and the beginning of Patrician scholarship in the late 19th century. So thank you.
Very good. Thanks, Sophie. Thanks for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be back in this society, small but intelligent, as we always said. So and I really need the feedback for this. So this is a project that is I'm toying with for let me think, maybe 7-8 years, but I have not made much progress. Why not? Will become apparent at the end of the talk. Really, but when Sophie asked me whether I would give a talk here, every one of us has plenty of talks in the drawer, but none of which I thought was fitting for this society. So I thought anything with Patrick always works in Ulster, right? So that's okay. Putting Zimmer in actually makes that tricky because Zimmer was one of the strong advocates that Patrick was never in this part of the world. Right, so we'll come back to that, but therefore I don't start with Zimmer, who Michal will probably know him as the Ishmael of Celtic studies. This is how he was, because I think he never wrote anything. Well, he principally wrote against people and against other people's theories. He never really wrote his own kind of theory. So this is the kind of character we are dealing with. I still like him for various reasons. Probably because he was a lookalike. We'll get back to that as well. But Peter, if you could change to the next slide, I actually want to start talking about a different person, because this is actually the person who's usually considered as kind of the first to have produced the first scientific biography of Patrick, right? And that is very fitting for this society because obviously born in Monaghan, right, educated in Derry, then he went to Trinity, became Erasmus Smith Professor of Modern History. Modern, obviously, at the time meant everything past classical, post-classical, and then Regius Professor of Modern History at Cambridge. And he wrote the book on Patrick right after his move to Cambridge. Generally, so his name is John Bagnell Bury, I think he's supposed to be pronounced. And a really interesting person if you're interested in kind of historical scholarship of the 19th century, because he went into the philosophy of history writing, and for him the big turn at the end of the 19th century is it all has to be scientific. It's not about narrating, it's about proving the facts. And for him it was, and he wanted it to be considered a science. And his take on Patrick is I mean, it's actually curious that he was professor of modern history because he was a classicist, but a late classicist. So we would probably, he hated that term, but we would probably call him a Byzantinist. So the late Roman Empire, mostly the Eastern Roman Empire, but he was then interested also in the spread of Roman culture beyond Rome. So this is where Patrick comes in, right? The spread of Christianity connected to Rome. This is where his interest is from. Peter, if you could put on the next slide. So I will read 3 pages of the preface because there's so much in it. This again is considered the first scientific book on Patrick. I'll just read it out. You can follow it on the screen. And I will stress where I think it becomes really important and really important for this talk. And perhaps the scope of this book will be best understood if I explain that the subject attracted my attention, not as an important crisis in the history of Ireland, but in the first place as an appendix to the history of the Roman Empire, illustrating the emanations of its influence beyond its frontiers. And in the second place, as a notable episode in the series of conversions which spread over Northern Europe, the religion which prevails today. Studying the work of the Slavonic apostles, Cyril and Methodius, I was led to compare them with other European missionaries, Wulfilas, for instance, and Augustine, Boniface, and Otto of Bamberg. When I came to Patrick, I found it impossible to gain any clear conception of the man and his work. The subject was wrapped in obscurity, and this obscurity was encircled by an atmosphere of controversy and conjecture. So there was nothing out there. He needed to clear the myths. Doubts of the very existence of St. Patrick had, and then Peter, please, had been entertained. In other views, almost amounted to the thesis that if he did exist, he was not himself, but a namesake. If he did exist, he was not himself, but a namesake. That's Zimmer. So he really writes against Zimmer. That will become obvious. I have not yet worked out the chronology exactly of his publication, but Zimmer's publication that these guys reacted to was first published in German in 1899, and then in English translation in 1901. This book came out in 1904. It's a tight window. It's a 600-page book. You would expect him to have started work on this earlier. And so I don't think it's necessarily an immediate reaction, but a lot of this is written against Zimmer. So it was at once evident that the material had never been critically sifted. That's important for him. Loads of people wrote about Patrick, never critically. And that it would be necessary to begin at the beginning, almost as if nothing had been done in a field where much had been written. And this is now the second person I will be talking about, because there was a lot written, but that will give you a sense of what was written about Patrick before it. This may seem unfair to the work of Todd, which in learning and critical acumen stands out preeminent from the mass of historical literature which has gathered around St. Patrick. And I should like unreservedly to acknowledge that I found it an excellent introduction to the subject. But there's a big but here. But it left me doubtful about every fact connected with Patrick's life. The radical vice of the book is that the indispensable substructure is lacking. The preliminary task of criticizing the sources methodologically had never been performed. Todd showed his scholarship and historical insight in dealing with a particular passage or that particular statement, but such sporadic criticism. So he wants, you need to get the full set of sources, you need to read it all, and only from that you can, rather than you have a preset narrative and you pick and choose whatever fits that narrative. There was no substitute for methodological Quellenkritik. It's interesting that he uses the German term. We'll come back to that. Hence, his result might be right or wrong, but they could not be convincing. It is a minor defect in Todd St. Patrick that it is not impartial. By this, I mean that he wrote with an unmistakable ecclesiastical bias. It is not implied that he would have ever stooped to a misrepresentation of the evidence for the purpose of proving a particular thesis. No reader would accuse him of that. But it is clear that he was anxious to establish a particular thesis. He does not conceal that the conclusion to which the evidence, as he interpreted it, conducted him, were conclusions which he wished to reach. In other words, he approached a historical problem with a distinct preference for one solution rather than another. And this preference was due to an interest totally irrelevant to mere historical truth. The business of a historian is to ascertain facts. There's something essentially absurd in his wishing that any alleged fact should turn out to be true or should turn out to be false. So far as he entertains a wish of the kind, his attitude is not critical. So that gives you the sense. So the history writing about Patrick beforehand was ecclesiastical, clouded by the religious beliefs of the authors. And if you are unbiased, engaging with the sources, you may get a different picture. Okay, Peter, please, the next one. Where he's coming from, and again, I think this would be really interesting for somebody who's interested in late 9th century Irish or on these two islands history writing, his obsession with it being scientific. And you can really see, I mean, whenever I read this, I'll have kind of the invention of the light bulb and things like Edison and all of these guys in mind, the cars and the rest of it, where you really get the sense that it's about science, it's about progress and all of these things. And you see it if you just read through, this is a table of contents of the essays that he wrote, you really get a sense of that history and the idea of progress, history and pragmatism, history and rhetoric. His lecture, his first lecture at Cambridge was The Science of History. right? So this is where this man is coming from. Just for you to get a sense of the people he wrote against. Peter, the next slide, please. This is Todd, James Henson Todd, who was a rector in the Church of Ireland, a priest, and you will get the sense actually in this short extract of this is from his preface to, again, I mean, even the title, right? St. Patrick, Apostle of Ireland. That's crucial, which is the big question to the present day. A memoir of his life and mission. It was necessary also, and this is from 40 years before, okay? It was necessary also, in order to correct certain popular mistakes, to draw attention to the fact that from the 11th century to the Reformation, there were two churches in Ireland, each ignoring, as far as it could, the existence of the other. And that since the Reformation, a third church has sprung up, deriving its succession from a foreign source. Whilst the original Irish church, properly so called, having merged into the Church of the English Pale, has adopted the Reformation and lost in a great measure its hold upon the descendants of the native tribes. Just the terminology is interesting. This loss is to be attributed to that old and deep-seated disaffection to England, which is the parent of almost all the political and social evils of the country. So this is his viewpoint, right? So he writes as a Protestant, writes a Protestant history of Patrick and trying to prove that he's the missionary of what he calls the original Irish church, and that post-Reformation, that is the continuation of this ancient Irish church. Okay, Peter, please, the next one. I think we can probably skip this one. This is just giving you a sense of the one thing that he proves, and he obviously loves it, but he claims that this is all, the one thing that he proves is Patrick could not have been sent from Rome. That's impossible. I mean, everybody who, I'll give that away, so there's only one line in 5th century Irish history that we can place in time. That is by a guy called Prosper of Aquitaine, who wrote in 433 about an event in 431. And he says, Palladius, being consecrated by Pope Celestine, was sent to the Irish believing in Christ as their first bishop. So that is the one sentence of 5th century Irish history, the only kind of anchorage knowledge we have about what happened in 5th century Ireland, and it gives away so many interesting things. It's a guy called Palladius who sent from Rome as a first bishop of Irish already believing in Christ, not to evangelize, not to Christianize them. So anyway, this gives you a sense of, this is the kind of element that he really enjoyed writing about that. Everything else, he wants Patrick to be the apostle of the Irish and the originator of the old Irish church, but he is not sent from Rome. Okay, next slide, please, Peter. So this is Bury really is the beginning of Irish of scholarship, or as it is perceived, on St. Patrick. And what Bury has kind of what Bury has done in a very, very interesting way, it's such an interesting book, is he has proven the tradition of Patrick. You would say, okay, it's Palladius who sent, but Palladius is sent in 431, mission fails immediately, and a year later Patrick comes and Christianizes the whole island, right? So this is what the Armagh propagandists tried to make us believe in the 7th century, and he bought their argument and proved them scientifically with a lot of number crunching. Actually, it's a lot about chronology and the rest of it. And then came T. of O'Reilly in a lecture given in 1941, published in 1942, on the two Patricks. There are more than one, and the Patrick that we love as the so-called apostle of the Irish is the second one. He came late, and Palladius is the person who did everything, and the Patrick left us two writings: his confession and the letter to the soldiers of Carolingian. That is a later Patrick. And I think then Vinci, when he commented on it in 1961, he called this an atomic bomb that was placed on Irish scholarship. This man had just become the director of the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, which had just been created under De Valera, right, as a institute for the study of physics and astronomy and Celtic studies. There you have this person trying to undermine the Irish saint. They waited for old McNeill to comment on it. Old McNeill, well known in this part of the world, and old McNeill said, "This is all rubbish." And then the nation was happy again. But very interesting figure, T.F. O'Reilly. His books went to Queen's, actually. I think his whole library went to Queen's. I'll have not looked I'm not sure where the papers are, but we'll come back to that, because this man also has had a 500-page biography of Patrick, which was never published. I have not chased it. Maybe it is somewhere, but famously his wife burned almost everything of his papers afterwards, because she thought that scholarship had consumed his life. Therefore he died early, and she was so angry that she burned most of the papers. So that may be gone. We'll come back to Patrick, biographies of Patrick and fire. And I'm not reading this out now, but it will give you yeah, no, I'm not reading it out because there will be summary later on. Peter, next slide, please. Exactly, this one here. So this just gives you a rough sense of the various theories, but the key point I'm trying to drive is Bury really started a trend. Then there was kind of reinterpretations of Patrick for up into the 1961. That will be the final slide. So it's kind of 60 years of scholarship on Patrick, where it went back and forth, where to place this person, whereas since then certainly the discussion has not been as there are still three theories that every student of mine will need to get their head around. They need to read these authors, and they'll create their own opinion. The traditional view always was this, and let's start with this. And the key question here is this one: Patrick is made Bishop of Ireland by Pope Celestine. That is a myth which, by reading Prosper of Aquitaine, can immediately be dismissed. Patrick arrives then in 432. This has always been proclaimed as the core moment or the beginning of Irish history. And Patrick dies in 493 at the age of 120. Obviously, 120 is chosen by the propagandists, as we would call them now, Amar propagandists, because it's the life of Moses. So they have no interest in, this is not about historical accuracy. What you basically mean by that number is he is Moses-like, right? Same as if you look at here, and this is where it's interesting that Bury did not question that number. From 432, when he believes Patrick arrives, to his death, it's almost 30 years. It is 30 years counted inclusively, which is Christ's lifespan. So immediately they played with these biblical number theory, if you like, to create, for them it's like an attribute, Christ-like, Moses, okay? But Bury, the change that Bury made is, it was Palladius who came, and this already Todd had made, because Todd had an interest. Palladius comes to Rome, comes from Rome to Ireland, unsuccessful, goes to Britain, dies there the next year, and Patrick takes up his work, which is almost the same story as this. And then what Bury did also is he said, this is a myth. So Patrick died a bit earlier, but he really is in strong favor of Patrick is the apostle of the Irish. O'Reilly then changes the whole setup, and I'll give you the sources here that Bury put all his faith in Amar propagandist, writing 200 years after the fact in Amar, to make the claim for the first time that Amar should have the primacy over all the churches of Ireland. Therefore, they need this patron saint, Patrick. And he put all his faith actually into those writers. Whereas O'Reilly was a student of the Irish Annals. And in the Irish Annals, you have various entries on Patrick. But the Irish Annals would read here Palladius. They changed actually the phrase. Prosper had said, Palladius, consecrated by Pope Celestine, was sent to the Irish believing in Christ as their first bishop. The Irish Annals say Palladius, consecrated by Pope Celestine, to Christianize the Irish. So this evangelizing aspect was immediately turned or introduced. Then the Annals say that Patrick arrives, Patrick dies again 30 years later. That's what the Annals do. So what O'Reilly basically said, well, here only the name was changed. It was actually Palladius was consecrated. Palladius, not Patrick, arrives the next day. Palladius is the first person who dies, and then only the last entry refers to Patrick, and Patrick comes later and he dies later. So he's the successor, really. And then Esposito, and this is based on the Annals. Obviously, the problem with the Annals is they are contemporary from the mid-6th century, but the oldest manuscript we have is from the 11th. Anything can obviously happen there, and it went through a northern phase, maybe continued in Bangor, maybe continued in Armagh. But whenever you continue history, you do not just continue, but you rewrite, right? So, and this is what probably has happened here. And then Esposito came with this theory of, if you only look at Patrick's own writings, he only left 2 writings, no dating in them. But you can look at the Latinity, you can look at the Bible quotations that he uses. You're already using the Vulgate or earlier versions, and so on. And he came up with the idea that Patrick actually, no, if you place Patrick before Palladius, everything makes perfect sense. The author of these 2 letters, he was earlier, he was Christianizing, therefore you have Christians. So if then this Palladius is sent to the Irish believing in Christ, this is the work of Patrick. Right, so these are the various theories, but it starts really with Bury bringing this into the domain, and this is more or less the endpoint. And the real endpoint is, Peter, the next slide, please. Is this is Vinci, and whenever I think everybody who teaches Patrick starts with this. I'll give my students the first 3 theories, but normally you'll start here. You say, okay, Vinci had neatly summarized it in was it 62, maybe 61, forgot now. I think this is probably right. So he basically, it's the old days where you could still write a 170-page article. I don't think any journal would accept that these days anymore. Vinci himself also really interesting character. So he was the Irish ambassador in the Weimar Republic in Germany at the rise of the Nazis in 1929, 1930. Then he moved to Mussolini's Italy, and his first book was on the church in fascist Italy. That was the first book, a lawyer, really bright mind. And he then became, I think, also the director of the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, working principally on Irish law. But he wrote this is the famous article of kind of surveying what's out there. And he says, its chief merit, that is O'Reilly, who had this 2 Patrick theory. Its chief merit lies not so much in the positive solution of the patrician problem, which it proposes, or this is at best uncertain, as in its devastating criticism of the gospel according to Bury. So that gives you a sense of even Vinci 60 years later thinks, okay, the field was always dominated by this book by Bury. Okay, so this is just to give you a sense of how the scholarship developed and how important or how much Bury was always perceived as the starting point of this. Peter, next slide, please. So where's Bury coming from? Why does Bury think he's doing something different? Well, I'll just took out this one term, obviously, Quellenkritik. He's always referring to Leopold von Ranke, right, as most of us who have to teach historical theory will. Ranke famously in 1824 wrote something like, to history has been assigned the office of judging the past, of instructing the present for the benefit of future ages. To such high offices, this work does not aspire. So it's not about judging the past, and it's not about the benefit of future ages. It simply is, it wants only to show what actually happened. Right? So that's a famous phrase. And this is kind of, I gave you here the foundation of the Monumenta Germani Historica, which is to the present day, is editing all sources related to medieval Germany, right? So this is the kind of, the sources are the fundamental basis. Analyzing them critically is the only work that historians should do. No judgment, nothing else. So this is the kind of background that inspired Bury. Actually, interestingly, von Ranke, I'm not sure whether there could be an interesting connection. Von Ranke was married to Clarissa Helena Graves, so an Irish woman, a very well-known family, also especially in church circles, Church of Ireland circles. So there may have been actually an interesting connection. I haven't followed it up, but I thought that could be interesting. Okay, Peter, next slide, please. Now, this is the other important aspect, obviously. So he writes the life of Patrick because he wants to do it this scientifically, because it has not done before scientifically. And in all of his appendices. It's full of appendices, and whenever I teach Patrick or early medieval Ireland generally, I'll ask my students always, do you read old literature that is 100 years old, and why would you? My brother, who's a physicist, would always say anything that is older than 5 years is certainly outdated, isn't it? Whereas the beauty, obviously, because of the source criticism, if you want to get your head around a certain topic and all the sources available for that topic, this book still is beautiful because it outlines every single source that deals with St. Patrick and gives you the background to it. Therefore, loads of appendices. And the last one is Professor Zimmer's theory. And he really has a grudge on that guy. And I still think it is something that has driven, maybe he had his notes already, but writing it up, it came from reading Zimmer. I don't think I can ever prove it. Peter, next slide, please. Just to give you a sense of Zimmer then, and where this kind of tradition comes from. So Bury was strongly looking to Germany for Quellenkritik, that's one thing, but Celtic studies in Germany started with this man here, Johann Caspar Zeus. I think there was a stamp recently released with his kind of an Irish stamp, because what he basically did is he reconstructed Old Irish, right, on the basis of something like this. So these are interlinear glosses, usually Latin to Old Irish, and then through that he reconstructed the language, and he published this Grammatica Celtica in 1853. That's the beginning of the study of Old Irish, and kind of so the German tradition of dealing with early medieval Ireland is coming from the linguists, purely from the linguists. And one of the key members of that group, if you like, was Ernst Windisch, who became professor of Sanskrit, but Sanskrit became the big thing in the 19th century. It's not necessarily the Celtic languages. So all of the European reconstructing Sanskrit was the really big thing. But they would teach Celtic languages and so on as well. And Heinrich Zimmer then became in 1881 professor of Sanskrit and Indo-European languages in Greifswald, where I worked myself 6 years, every day going to work. I walked past where he lived. So that gave me a connection to this guy Zimmer. We will come back to that. And then in 1901, Zimmer is the first professor of Celtic languages in Berlin, right? And I think the first professor of Celtic languages anywhere. So this is the kind of tradition that he's coming from. And I think Bury did not like him for that reason as well, because he would not consider him an historian, but a linguist. And that was something different for him. Next slide, please. So Zimmer wrote on Patrick famously in this article here, Keltische Kirche in Britannien and Irland, which was translated by Anthony Meyer in 1901. I think that did not really get much reception then, but when it was translated, Anthony Meyer is the sister of Kuno Meyer, who is another great Celticist. And this is the man, right? In the old days when I had short hair, people would always, but still already the beard, people would always say he's a lookalike. So this man, provocative as provocative can be, and what he wrote in this, and because it was translated, a huge uproar on these two islands. So what he basically said is, what fairly accurate account can be given of the introduction of Christianity to Ireland as the outcome of the foregoing argument? How is the historical Patrick related to Prosperous Palladius, and what part did he play in the Irish Church of the 5th century? In the first place, it must be evident that the historical Patricius, Patrick, and Prosperous Palladius are one and the same people. So this has always been read as Patrick did not exist. It was only Palladius, and the Confessio and the Epistola were written by Palladius as well. There's no such, and Palladius is not, and this is crucial, Palladius or Patrick is not a missionary, and very limited influence, only in Leinster. This was his argument. Never made it to the north, and the rest of it. So this is how what then Bury reacts to. Peter, the next slide, please. So this is Bury against Zimmer now, right? In another note, I have referred to Zimmer's identification of Patrick with Palladius. This is necessitated by, but would not necessitate his theory. If it were demonstrated tomorrow that Patrick and Palladius were one and the same persons, this would be quite as compatible with the view of Patrick adopted in the foregoing pages as with the view of Zimmer. So he basically says, yeah, well, with just everything I outlined, just call the guy Palladius, we call him Patrick, that's fine. But he still Christianized all the Irish, he still came in 432 and the rest of it, whereas this is not what Zimmer believed. Palladius may provisionally be left out of the account for the purpose of the present criticism and so on. Zimmer fully admits, though he had once denied, the genuineness of the confession and the missive to the subjects of Carolingians. That is, he admits that they were written by Patricius, a bishop in Ireland in the 5th century. But he holds that the activity of this bishop was entirely confined to the southeast Ireland, Leinster, that he accomplished nothing for the evangelization or ecclesiastical organization of the rest of Ireland, that he died conscious of failure, and for nearly 2 centuries after his death had a merely local reputation. So this was Zimmer's big theory. And I think this really got under Bury's skin. It's not that you now call him Palladius, that's fine, but that he did nothing for the evangelization. Basically what Zimmer did in terms of historical analysis. The first mention of Patrick is in the letter of Cumian's letter of 633. That means 200 years of silence, and only then Patrick he's called Papa Noster at the time, and so already there's a big cult. Cumian's letter is written in the south, not in the north. That already made him wonder. And then people like Bede, who were well informed about the Irish Church, they knew Palladius, no word about Patrick. Right, so he's thinking there's far too much silence for this having been a big cult before the 7th century. And Bury wanted to prove the opposite. Peter, next slide, please. Now, the problem really is how much do we know about that Zimmer? Is it just this one article, or how much do we know about his views on Patrick? And this is where this talk really originated. Zimmer had written, it's a beautiful book, Pelagius in Ireland, or Pelagius in Ireland, rather. So, I don't think it has been translated into English. What he basically says, so this is a publication of 1901. And he basically says, for 20 years, I have worked on this topic. In 1894, I'll have finished a full-scale analysis of the problem of Patrick, which means monograph length of the Patrician legend. But it was never brought to publication. But in 1899, I was asked to write this article, which was then translated by Anthony Meyer into English. And this drove me back to the topic, and therefore I wrote this book, Pelagius in Ireland. But what he basically says there, he has a big tome, a big study of the Patrician legend somewhere on his desk, never published. Okay, next slide, please. So this then makes it, if you want to be polemic, and Wikipedia entries and the rest of it, and the Twitters of this world, they are polemic. They always design this man as the beginning of the scientific study of Patrick. If Zimmer really had a book written finished in 1894 of that scale, and clearly he was a good scholar. Even Bury calls him a brilliant Celticist, not a brilliant historian, which is probably important. So then this would not have been the first. And what he claims here, right? Nobody has ever critically sifted the material. Maybe Zimmer has done it. Okay, next slide, please. Zimmer died. When Zimmer died, he committed suicide. I don't think there's only one term in English, isn't there, for suicide? There are two in German, and they mean different things. So it's Selbstmord and it's Freitod. Freitod is kind of you take your own life because it's the better of two choices, right? So if you're mortally ill, like Zimmer was, he killed himself. Became a very popular term under the Nazis. Obviously, you would rather take your life than being brought to the gas chambers or something like that. But it was not. That never had that negative connotation. As suicide, I think in English only has the negative connotation. I'm not 100% sure. But he basically, so Zimmer was mortally ill. Probably it's not 100% certain, but he drowned himself in 1910. So Kuno Meyer, this is Kuno Meyer, who became his successor in Berlin on that chair for Celtic studies, looked through his papers. And he said, yes, there is this what does he say? It's there is an account of the origin of the Patrick legend, exactly what Zimmer had said before. And the next page, please, Peter. And then in a different publication of the same year, he said, among the manuscripts left by Zimmer, so Kuno Meyer actually almost always wrote in English. Very interesting character. He only went back to Berlin to work in Germany for that job in Berlin. Before he was in Liverpool most of his life. Among the manuscripts left by Zimmer, there's a large bundle of papers, much damaged by fire, containing a connected account of the introduction of Christianity into Ireland and the life of St. Patrick. As most of this had already been published by him in some form or another, I decided not to print it. So this is what he said in his kind of article on the Nachlass. But on closer inspection, I have found 2 chapters which contain some new and important contributions to our knowledge. So this is the point where you really would like to have Zimmer's work. The next slide, Peter, please. This is it. So we found it. So this is me all why I said you can't leave before this. So it is in 600 pages. It's in the what is now the Berlin-Brandenburgische Akademie der Wissenschaften. It was before the First World War and before the Nazi Germany, the Preußische Akademie der Wissenschaften, then became the Akademie der Wissenschaften of the GDR, right? So when I was in Berlin, I looked for stuff related to Zimmer because Zimmer was working obviously in Berlin. So I thought maybe there are some of his papers. They're well documented. This was not documented. So there was kind of this, just an envelope with 600 pages of this. So you can see how they are, some of them are damaged by fire. They gave me the envelope on the day. I took it out, started reading through it, and then I saw that the pages are crumbling. And I asked them, what should we do with this? And they said, don't touch it. They just put it back. But this is where it is now. So I don't really know what's in it. This is why I wanted to give this paper next year, because then we have negotiated, okay, how can we restore it so that we can read it? 24K, so 24,000 this cost. So I spent the past few years to look for a bit of money here and there. So now the Department of Foreign Affairs has decided that they put 6,000 into it so that we can restore and as a pilot, just to see how much it would really cost. That was just an estimate. So we will have by the end of this year at least a few pages restored, and I hope that they start restoring these, actually not these but these, because that is a third of the manuscript, and we really get a sense of what's there. And here it will be quite difficult to write, as you can see, but it's worth having, probably. So why is it so damaged? Why does it look like that? Peter, the next slide, please. Meyer said that this is a correspondence that Dorville Cronin published when Meyer was writing to Douglas Hyde on the 6th of July in 1903. There's just one sentence before, and this is the whole letter, and it's about Zimmer's house. So I have just heard a terrible news from Berlin. Poor Zimmer's house has been burnt down and his whole library and collections destroyed. How he will bear the shock with his shattered nerves, I tremble to think. I'm trying to think how we could help him and cheer him. Do you think the Gaelic League might present him with a complete set of their publications? You know, he was a regular subscriber to every Irish publication. Such an attention will greatly cheer him. But the intimation should reach him soon. Can you take it upon yourself? His address is, and this gives you a sense that he's in a sanatorium in the mountains. So the beauty of this is we know exactly when it happened roughly. So basically this, if you want to reconstruct the history of this manuscript, obviously it was 10 years lying on Zimmer's desk. Then it got recovered, at least half recovered. It did not burn fully. And this is what we have. Peter, the next slide, please. Now there's a bit more actually in it, which is quite interesting. So there are some 35 letters to a guy called William Scherer, and 4 postcards, and 42 letters to, I think it's Johannes Schmidt, which are quite interesting. This is Scherer, this is Schmidt. Scherer was a German philologist. Schmidt was a Slavic linguist, and these were his first teachers. So when Zimmer was in Strasbourg, which was then after the German-Frankish War, 1871, it became German, and immediately they put all of the young German clever minds into the Strasbourg University. Zimmer, coming from a farmer's background, right? It's a nice kind of difference, if you like, to Bury, right? Who clearly came from an established household. He studied in Strasbourg under Scherer first, and you can see it here in his letters. None of these are published or anything. We could do something with this for the background, because if you see, so this is him writing to his teacher from Tübingen. That's where he studied. Berlin, where he studied. Dublin, when he went to Ireland on a regular basis. Oxford, Greifswald, Zeitung for postcards, and then he did the same with Schmidt, whom we met later. But I think it's almost 100 letters. Covering quite a period, very complementary. These stop in 86, these start in 87. So, but I'm sure there are plenty more letters of Zimmer. We would start looking for them. All of Zimmer's books, and actually, interestingly, came to UCD. So I'll have not looked through all of those, whether there could be annotations. I'm not sure what, but I think all his papers stayed in Berlin. I don't think they moved anywhere else. It's a common feature that the papers stay very close to home, whereas the books may be sent the same with orally, right? The books came here. I don't think any papers are here, but I would need to double check as well. Now, the big question for me now is, should we do it? And that's a genuine question. And this is actually the question that I would like to discuss here. Peter, the last slide, please. Because again, this is the passage I had before. He had written it in 1894. He himself did not publish it till he died. He could have published it after this book. He could have published another book. For us, it's obviously, if we're interested in the development of patrician scholarship, we could give him this kind of sensationalist claim as the first scientific biography of Patrick and so on. Would he have liked it? Would you have liked, I mean, there's a reason why he published a lot. There's a reason why he did not publish it. So I'm not sure if after my death, I would like to things that were in my drawer, just publish the way they are, right? And it's, and we'll forget that kind of perspective to it. So I'm wondering whether we're genuinely, I think we're doing the right thing in preserving it. Whether it should really be published. I'm really not sure ethically. I'm not sure whether that is a good or a bad thing for the scholar. I remember when was that? Maybe some 10 years ago. What was her name? I think Vivian Meyer, a brilliant street photographer. And it's beautiful to have all of these pictures now. It was a bit sensationalist. I got the sense that the guy who found the pictures was more interested in his own kind of, I discovered this, than in the pictures themselves. And yes, it's the same with the, I think with letters, that has become standard, right? Whenever to publish the letters of scholars, would you like your emails to be published? Right. So I'm not sure what to do with scholar biographies generally, and whether there is an ethical issue there. For me, in my mind, there still is. I would still love to see this done. It would obviously take a lot of work. First, restoring, that's a lot of money. It's not that much work. But then afterwards, the handwriting is not easy. You will then need to translate it, obviously, from the German into English to get some audience and so on. I'm still inclined to do it, I'll have to admit, but I'll have serious doubts about, especially this kind of, if I think about what's in my drawer, some of it would be ready to go. I still never sent it somewhere. There's a reason why I haven't, right? And there's a reason here as well. So I'm not sure. Okay, that's more or less basically it. Thanks a lot.